Britain is a house that kept adding rooms without ever agreeing on the rules of the house. Since 1948, waves of migration built new wings. By 2021, 6.5% of England and Wales, 3.9 million people, was Muslim. Then came 7/7ths, grooming gang cover-ups, Gaza marches of 100,000, and a country asking who actually lives here now. So, how did Britain go from welcoming the world to saying no more? The first room was built on a promise nobody stopped to examine. The 1948 British Nationality Act gave every Commonwealth citizen the right to settle in Britain, and through the 1950s and 60s, workers from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India were actively recruited to staff the textile mills of the north and the wards of the new NHS. London Transport ran recruitment offices in Barbados starting in 1956. British Rail and the NHS sent officials directly to Kingston and Bridgetown to sign up staff before they ever set foot in Britain. By 1961, roughly 100,000 people born in the Caribbean were living in the UK. By 1971, over 600,000 people of South Asian origin had settled, concentrated heavily in Bradford, Birmingham, and the East End of London. Nobody in Whitehall drew up a plan for what came next. The 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act was the first attempt to slow the flow, restricting entry to those with employment vouchers, but it came a decade too late to shape settlement patterns already hardening into permanent neighborhoods. Mosques rose in Bradford, in Birmingham, in East London. The Brick Lane Mosque, once a Huguenot chapel and then a synagogue, became a mosque in 1976, a single building tracing 3 waves of migration under one roof. Entire communities took root on the assumption that shared work and shared streets would eventually mean a shared life. That assumption held, officially, for decades, until the rooms turned out to have locked doors between them. In 2001, riots tore through Bradford, Oldham, and Burnley, white and South Asian communities clashing in the streets of towns that had lived side by side for a generation. The Bradford riots alone, over the weekend of 7 to the 9th of July, injured over 300 police officers and caused an estimated £27 million in damage. More than 200 people were eventually convicted, many receiving sentences of 4 years or more for riot. The Cantle report that followed didn't mince words. These were communities living parallel lives, sharing a postcode but nothing else. Ted Cantle's team found schools in Oldham that were 90% white or 90% Asian within a few streets of each other, and housing estates where residents of different backgrounds had never once entered each other's homes. By then, the numbers had exploded. Britain's Muslim population had nearly doubled in a decade, from 1.5 million in 1991 to 2.7 million in 2001. And the house had far more rooms than anyone had rules for. Britain told itself the danger, if it ever came, would come from outside. On the 7th of July, 2005, it arrived from inside the house instead. 52 people were killed in coordinated bombings across the London transport network, carried out not by foreign infiltrators but by 4 British-born men: Mohammed Sadiq Khan, Shahzad Tanweer, Jermaine Lindsay, and Hasib Hussain, 3 of them from Leeds. Over 700 people were injured in the attacks on 3 underground trains and a bus in Tavistock Square. MI5's watch lists swelled to include thousands of names over the following decade. By 2017, the security service was reportedly monitoring around 3,000 individuals as subjects of interest, with another 20,000 having passed through its files at some point, a standing admission that radicalization was now a domestic problem, not an imported one. When the Manchester Arena and London Bridge attacks struck in 2017, killing 22 and 8 people respectively, the arena bomb detonated by Salman Abedi, a British citizen born in Manchester to Libyan parents. They weren't a shock in the way 7/7ths had been. They were confirmation of a fear Britain had already learned to live with. While the country watched for bombs, it missed a different horror hiding in plain sight. Authorities in Rotherham had spent years insisting that reports of organized child abuse were isolated incidents, even after a 2010 prosecution jailed 5 men from the town for grooming offenses. The 2014 Jay report, authored by Professor Alexis Jay, demolished that claim. Over 1,400 children had been abused in the town between 1997 and 2013, and officials had known. The report was blunt about why nobody acted. A fear of being called racist because the perpetrators were disproportionately of Pakistani heritage. One Rotherham Council researcher's internal reports on the scale of abuse were reportedly suppressed in 2002 and again in 2003. Rochdale, Oxford, and Telford followed with strikingly similar stories. In Rochdale, 9 men were convicted in 2012 of running a child sexual exploitation ring across the town. In Telford, a 2022 independent inquiry found at least 1,000 children had been abused over decades. The same pattern of warnings ignored, the same silence dressed up as sensitivity. That silence finally broke. More than a decade later, under public pressure Westminster could no longer absorb. In 2025, the government announced a new national inquiry into grooming gangs, forced into being by survivors who refused to let the story die, among them campaigners like Sammy Woodhouse, who had waived her own anonymity years earlier to keep the issue in public view. Baroness Louise Casey's review, published in June 2025, went further than Rotherham had, criticizing the systemic refusal across public bodies to even record the ethnicity of offenders. Her audit found ethnicity was left unrecorded in the majority of cases examined nationally, data that could have exposed the pattern years earlier. Survivors and campaigners are now demanding the inquiry carry full statutory powers, the ability to compel testimony, not just collect it, backed by warnings that at least 12 local authority areas may need dedicated local inquiries of their own. Around the same time, a very different fault line was opening, over what could be said, drawn, or printed without fear. In 2021, a teacher at Batley Grammar School showed his class a cartoon of Muhammad during a religious studies lesson and, within days, was in hiding under police protection. His name and face circulated as a threat rather than a lesson. 4 years later, he remained unable to return to teaching under his own identity. In 2023, a Quran desecration incident in Wakefield involving a 14-year-old boy who scuffed a copy of the Quran at school triggered a police hate crime investigation and a formal community reconciliation event, and critics on all sides began asking the same uncomfortable question. Was Britain quietly reintroducing blasphemy law, just without the name? Then a war on the other side of the world walked straight into Britain's streets. From October 2023, pro-Palestinian marches in London drew crowds estimated above 100,000 week after week, some of the largest demonstrations in the city's history. Organizers claimed over 300,000 at the January 2024 march alone. The Metropolitan Police made hundreds of arrests over placards and chants judged anti-Semitic, including dozens under the Public Order Act during a single weekend in November 2023, while organizations tracking hate crime, the CST and Tel Mama, both recorded sharp rises in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidents alike. The CST logged over 4,100 anti-Semitic incidents in 2023, its highest annual total on record, while Tel Mama reported a more than 300% rise in anti-Muslim incidents in the months following October 7th. The house wasn't just divided over who lived in it anymore, it was divided over whose war this even was. For years, anyone who raised integration as a problem was accused of manufacturing one. That accusation became harder to sustain. The 2016 Casey Review, commissioned under David Cameron, found genuinely regressive practices affecting women in some isolated Muslim communities, including areas where over 20% of women reported speaking little or no English, not as a slur but as documented fact. Trevor Phillips, once one of multiculturalism's leading defenders as chair of the Commission for Racial Equality, warned in a 2016 Channel 4 documentary that Britain was sleepwalking into segregation. By 2023 and 2024, polling from Ipsos and YouGov showed a clear majority of Britons, consistently above 50% and closer to 60% in some surveys, believed immigration levels were simply too high, not a fringe sentiment anymore, but the settled view of the country. All that pressure had been building towards something, and in August 2024, the house finally cracked. A stabbing attack in Southport on the 29th of July, which killed 3 young girls, Bibe King, Elsie Stancombe, and Alice da Silva Aguiar, sparked false rumors about the attacker's identity, spreading online faster than any correction could follow, including a fabricated name claiming he was a Muslim asylum seeker. The real perpetrator, Axel Rudakubana, was a British-born teenager. Within a week, riots and disorder had spread to more than 27 towns and cities across the country, from Rotherham to Sunderland to Belfast. Over 1,000 people were arrested, and mosques were targeted in the unrest, including an attempted arson attack on a mosque in Southport itself the day after the killings. Misinformation, real grievance, and old anger detonating together, exactly where they'd been sitting unaddressed for years. Faced with a house on fire, the government stopped debating tone and started changing policy. The 2025 Labour government under Keir Starmer pledged faster asylum processing and a sharp increase in deportations, targeting tens of thousands of removals over the following 2 years. The Prevent Counter-Extremism program, which had referred over 6,000 people in the year following the Southport riots, was put under review, accused simultaneously of doing too much surveillance of ordinary Muslims and too little to stop actual radicalization. A criticism sharpened by the revelation that Axel Rudakubana himself had been referred to Prevent 3 times before the attack without being formally accepted onto the program. At the center of it sat a genuinely hard legal question Britain had avoided for 20 years. How do you define Islamism as a political ideology, distinct from Islam as a religion, in a way the law can actually use? That distinction turned out to be the whole point, and Britain is only now learning to make it properly. Muslim organizations like the British Muslim Trust have pushed back hard against being blamed collectively for the actions of extremists who claim to speak for them, pointing to the roughly 3.9 million British Muslims who had no connection whatsoever to any of the events dominating headlines. Government reports increasingly separate faith communities from Islamist extremist networks as a matter of policy, not just courtesy. Following recommendations from the government's own independent advisor on political Islam, surveys back this up plainly. A 2023 Policy Exchange poll found the overwhelming majority of British Muslims report strong national identity sitting comfortably alongside their religious identity, which is precisely the opposite of the single hostile bloc some had started to imagine. Britain isn't tearing the house down, whatever the loudest voices on either side might want. Cross-party consultations on integration policy launched in 2025, involving councils in Bradford, Oldham, and Tower Hamlets, among others, aiming at something more durable than the last 20 years of ad hoc reaction. Citizenship tests and school curricula are being rewritten around shared civic values, with proposals to overhaul the Life in the UK test for the first time since 2013, and the entire public debate has shifted. No longer multiculturalism versus assimilation, but a plainer question of enforceable common rules everyone actually follows. Un-HUS, un-SSOF rules. Britain spent 70 years adding rooms and postponing the argument about what held them together, and the bill for that postponement came due all at once. In Rotherham's silence, in Southport's fires, in marches that turned neighbors into suspects. The rooms aren't being knocked down, but for the first time, the country is arguing openly about the rules everyone in the house has to live by. Do you think Britain can still write those shared rules without losing what made it a house worth living in? Let us know what you think in the comments, and if this kind of story matters to you, subscribe for more.